Good morning, Emergence. My name's Mariah, and today's devotion is going to be on Ecclesiastes verses 1 through 6. So we're going to kind of be talking through what oppression and toil look like under the sun, apart from what God has called us to, and then we're going to bring it on back to what God has called us into in these areas. Starting in verse 1, it says, "So I returned and considered all of the oppressions that are done under the sun. And behold, the tears of the oppressed, and they had no comforter." What stands out to me in that verse is that people are crying out in their pain, and that no one is there to comfort them. And I kind of, in reflection, have been wondering if it was easier to turn a blind eye and to remain unaffected than to lean into the pain of those who are suffering. And then moving on further into that verse, it says, "And on the side of their oppressors was power, but they had no comforter." And so when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about how in our sinful nature, it is kind of our inclination to seek after power, to climb that ladder of success, even maybe at the expense of others. Moving on to verse 2, it says, "Wherever I praise the dead, which are already dead, more than the living, which are yet alive." And in verse 3, "It is better that both they who has not been born, who hath not seen the evil work that is done under the sun." So this is kind of talking about how, according to the author, it's better to be dead, or it's better not to be born, than to see the evil and the oppression that exists in the world. Which, this is kind of depressing. And then as we move on in verses 4 through 6, it goes on to talk about this catch-22 of, if I do seek after that power and I do seek after success with my whole heart, then I'm envied by others, and it ultimately leads to self-destruction. But on the other hand, if I fall into a spirit of laziness and idleness, that is a different type of self-destruction. So where do we go from here? Kind of the reality of all of this depression and evil and pain and envy. Well, I think what we can look to is what God has to say about oppression. So in Psalm 9:9, it says, "The Lord is the refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble." In Psalm 146, 7 through 9, it says, "He who executes justice for the oppressed, who gives food to the hungry, the Lord sets the prisoners free. He opens the eyes of the blind. The Lord raises up those who are bowed down. The Lord loves the righteous. The Lord protects the strangers. He supports the fatherless and the widow, but he thwarts the way of the wicked." And then kind of moving on to what God calls us to when it comes to oppression. In Luke 4:18 through 19, which also reflects a passage in Isaiah, it says, "The Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to set the oppressed free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor." So we worship a God who called Moses out of a place of oppression. He had this opportunity to come into a place of privilege in being adopted by the Egyptians. And he could have very easily sat idly by, turned a blind eye to those who were suffering, his people, the Israelites. But that's not what God called him to. God called him to come out of his place of power and to take up the cause of the Israelites and lead them into freedom. We worship a God who called Esther, who was brought into this, again, a place of privilege in being married to the king, to advocate for her people, the Jews, who were about to be subject to genocide, to take up their cause rather than sitting there unaffected by what was going on with them. And finally, we worship a God who took himself, his own son, Jesus, and brought him out of his status and humbled himself, becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross, to take up our cause, to take on our sin, so that he could lead us into freedom and reconciliation. And what does that mean for us? Well, I really think that from looking at this passage, we can see God's heart is for the oppressed, and we can think about, what comfort zone is God calling me out of? Like Moses, like Esther. What is he calling me to give up? And what issues is he calling me to maybe take on as my own, whether that be the race issues that we are seeing going on today, whether that be poverty or trafficking or the cause of refugees, and how can I reflect God's heart for justice and reconciliation in the world? That is our prayer and my prayer for us today as a church.